Hello and welcome back. I'm John, and if you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to me tonight. This is the place I keep for stories that are true and strange and old enough that no one has ever quite finished arguing about them. So, if you're already lying down, good. Let the lights go all the way off if you haven't already. Put the phone face down somewhere you won't reach for it, and let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding on all day. There's nowhere you need to be for the next little while except right here, listening. And if you feel like it, before you drift, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now settle in, because tonight's story starts with a ship that came sailing steadily along with nobody standing at her wheel at all. Picture the sea on a grey afternoon, no land anywhere, the swell long and slow the way it gets when the weather has been deciding what to do with itself for days. A ship is coming toward you across that swell, and something about the way she moves catches the eye before anything else does. Her sails are up, but not all of them, and the ones that are set are hanging wrong, not shredded, not torn away by a storm, just slack and uncertain, the way a coat looks when it's been thrown over a chair instead of worn. She yaws a little as she comes on, drifting off her line and then correcting or seeming to, the way a ship does when the hand on the wheel doesn't quite know where it means to go. And there is no hand on the wheel. You call out. You wait for an answer that does not come. No flag climbs her halyard, no face appears at her rail, no voice carries back across the water to tell you what has happened here. She simply keeps coming, unhurried, as though the ocean itself were still steering her by habit alone. That is the scene that met the crew of a ship called the Dei Gratia, and the vessel drifting toward them, empty and upright and strangely composed, was named the Mary Celeste. Her captain was a man named Benjamin Briggs, careful and well-regarded, the kind of master other captains spoke of with a kind of quiet approval. The man who found her, David Morehouse, commanded the Dei Gratia, and the two of you should know had actually known each other before that day. Sailors' paths crossed often enough in that world, and the two captains had reportedly dined together not long before their ships went their separate ways across the Atlantic. It is one of the strange, small details that sits at the center of this whole story. The man who discovered the abandoned ship was no stranger to the man who should have been standing on her deck. There is nothing you need to hold on to yet, no facts to memorize, no names to keep straight before you're ready. Just let the picture sit there in the dark behind your eyes. One ship finding another, empty, on an ocean with no one else around for miles. What made the discovery so unsettling wasn't simply that the Mary Celeste was empty. Ships were lost at sea often enough in that age of sail, swallowed whole by weather or wrecked against rock, and nobody would have thought twice about a ship gone missing entirely. This was different and stranger, because almost nothing was missing at all. When the boarding party finally climbed aboard her, they found a vessel that looked, in almost every particular, like a home that its family had simply stepped out of for a moment. The cargo sat undisturbed in the hold. Stores of food and fresh water remained aboard, more than enough to have carried her crew onward for a long while yet. Personal belongings were still tucked into their places below, including, it was later noted with a particular kind of quiet horror, items belonging to a child, for Briggs had brought his young daughter and his wife along on the voyage, as captains of that era sometimes did when a passage seemed a peaceable one. Toys, small clothes, the ordinary evidence of a family living aboard a working ship, left behind precisely as if everyone intended to come straight back to it. But where does a story like that even begin? Not with the empty ship herself, drifting and silent under half her canvas. That's only the moment somebody else stumbled into a mystery that had already been building for weeks. To understand what the Dei Gratia's crew found that afternoon, you have to go back further, back to a harbor thick with rigging and the smell of tar, back to a captain loading a ship he trusted, with a wife and a small daughter he loved standing beside him on the deck, in a world that still moved at the speed of wind and canvas, and nothing faster. That's where this story actually starts, and that's where I'm going to take you next, once you've had a moment simply to breathe and let this first part settle. because it is worth pausing here, on this image before the story moves forward. A hull rising and falling gently in an empty ocean, sails half set and doing nothing useful. No cry going up from her deck, no light showing at her stern come evening. If your eyes have already started to close, that is exactly the right thing for them to be doing. There's no test at the end of this. You don't have to hold on to a single name or date to enjoy where this is going. You only have to let the picture keep drifting, the way that ship drifted, patient and strange, waiting for someone to come close enough to ask her what had happened. What strikes most people when they first hear this story is not the absence of the crew so much as the presence of everything else. A table below deck was later found still laid, as though a meal had been interrupted rather than abandoned. Cups and a teapot sitting where hands had left them. Nothing shattered, nothing thrown, nothing that spoke of panic or struggle. A sewing machine sat undisturbed with a piece of work still resting beside it, the kind of small domestic detail that makes a stranger's absence feel entirely too close and too real. Charts remained in their place. The ship's log had entries running up to a point and then simply stopped, matter of fact, right up until it wasn't. None of the ship's papers that a captain would have needed to prove ownership and cargo were aboard. Those, it would turn out, were gone, along with the one small boat the Mary Celeste carried for emergencies. But almost everything a person could actually want, if they were fleeing for their life in genuine terror, had been left exactly where it sat. It's that combination, a boat missing, but a home left standing, that has kept people turning this story over in their hands for longer than either of those captains could have imagined. You are, right now, hearing about something that has puzzled sailors and investigators and quiet, curious minds like your own for well over a century, and nobody in all that time has ever produced a single answer that everybody agreed on. That's not a flaw in the story. That's the reason it's still being told at all in courtrooms and books, and now, tonight, in the dark, to you. Before this goes any further, I want to invite you to just stay with me a little while longer, because the rest of this is worth the patience it asks of you. We're going to go back to where the Mary Celeste actually began, not as a mystery, but as an ordinary working ship with an ordinary name, built in a modest yard the way hundreds of vessels were built in that era, long before anyone had reason to think her fate would be worth remembering. We'll meet Benjamin Briggs properly, the man people described as careful almost to a fault, the sort of captain who checked a line twice rather than trust it once. We'll meet his family and the small crew who signed aboard with him, most of whose names barely survived the century at all. And we'll follow that ship out of a crowded American harbor, loaded with a cargo that would later become one of the most argued over details in this entire case, bound for a port on the other side of an ocean she would never quite manage to cross with anyone left aboard to see it. None of that has happened yet, in the story as I'm telling it to you. Right now, she is still just a shape on the water, drifting steady and wrong, and a man named David Morehouse is still standing on the deck of another ship entirely, staring across the swell at a vessel he recognizes, wondering, the way you might be wondering right now, how a ship can look so entirely composed and be so entirely alone. The world that made a ship like that possible was not a small one, and it did not belong to any one port or any one family, though it liked to feel that way from the inside. Picture the harbor at first light, the way the masts stand up out of the mist like a leafless forest that has somehow learned to sway, and you will have some sense of what a working port looked like in the great age of sail, an age that was, even as it happened, already counting down its own years, though almost no one standing on those docks could have told you that yet. Steam was coming. Everyone half knew it. But for now, the wind still did the heavy work, and fortunes were still made and lost on whether a captain could read a sky correctly and trust a hull to hold. You would have smelled that world before you saw it. Tar and brine and wet rope, the sour tang of a fish market a few streets back, wood smoke from 100 galley stoves being lit at once. Ships came in from Liverpool and Bristol and Genoa, and ships went out again loaded with grain and cotton and barrel staves, and underneath all of it ran a current of alcohol in the specific sense that matters to this story, vast quantities of it, industrial and drinkable both, moved constantly across the Atlantic in casks that had to be sealed exactly right or not sealed right at all, depending on which theory you eventually find yourself drawn to. We are not there yet. For now, just the ships and the ports and the families who built their whole lives around the tide tables. Nova Scotia mattered enormously to this world, more than its size on a map would ever suggest to you. The colony's shipyards turned out vessel after vessel with a kind of quiet, unglamorous excellence. Sturdy, practical ships built by men who had grown up watching their fathers do the same work in the same coves, using timber that grew close enough to the water that you could sometimes walk a log from the felling site to the keel it would become without it ever leaving damp ground. If you had wandered those yards on a working morning, you would have found no ceremony in it at all, just axes and adzes and the patient, repetitive violence of a hull being coaxed into shape, plank by plank, over months that felt, to the men doing the work, entirely unremarkable. It was from exactly this world, this unglamorous competence, that the ship at the center of tonight's story first came down the ways, though we'll come to her properly in a moment. New York, meanwhile, sat at the other end of the same rope. If Nova Scotia built the ships, New York very often sent them out loaded and brought them home again richer or ruined. And its harbor in this period was one of the great chaotic engines of the age, piers stretching out into the water further than you could comfortably count, agents and brokers moving through the crowds with manifests under their arms, and everywhere the particular tension of a port that ran on credit and timing and the simple hope that the weather out past Sandy Hook would hold. It was a place built for departures. You could stand at the end of almost any pier there and watch a ship's sails fill and think, not unreasonably, that you were watching the whole appetite of a young country pointed outward at once. And it was a small world for all its size. That's the part that tends to surprise people when they first hear this story properly, that the ocean was vast, but the community that crossed it, again and again on the same handful of routes, was not vast at all. Captains knew captains, owners shared captains. A man who commanded a brig out of one harbor this year might be commanding a different vessel entirely for a different owner the next, and the crew he sailed with might scatter across 3 other ships the season after that, only to end up, half of them, back together again on a 4th. Families lived inside this rhythm rather than around it. Wives often sailed with their husbands on longer voyages, not as passengers exactly, but as a kind of second authority aboard, someone who kept the captain's cabin and sometimes the ship's accounts, and who was as much a fixture of the vessel as her figurehead. Benjamin Briggs's wife, Sarah, belonged to this pattern as naturally as breathing. She had grown up around exactly this world, the daughter of a minister, but the wife of a mariner, and by the time this story properly begins, she had already crossed a fair amount of open ocean at her husband's side, their small daughter often somewhere nearby underfoot. We'll meet them both properly very soon in their own right, so let that rest quietly for now, the way a name does when you've only just been introduced to it and know you'll be hearing it again. David Morehouse, the man you left standing on his own deck a few minutes ago, staring across the water at a ship he recognized, belonged to this same tight, overlapping world, which is precisely why he recognized her at all. Captains in this trade did not encounter strangers' ships so much as they encountered acquaintances' ships, vessels whose rigging and paint and general bearing they had studied at dock, in harbor taverns, across the tables of shared meals. If your eyes have already started to close somewhere in all this, that's all right. None of these names need to be held on to tightly tonight. They will come back around gently, the way ships in this story kept doing to each other, more than once, and more than by accident. But what did any of this actually cost a man? To put a ship like this to sea? That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it shapes everything that follows. A voyage across the Atlantic in this era was not simply an act of navigation, it was a financial commitment balanced on a set of assumptions that could unravel in a single bad storm. A merchant captain like Briggs was not merely sailing a ship. He was, in effect, managing a floating parcel of risk that belonged to several different parties at once. There was the ship herself, usually owned in shares. A captain might hold a portion of his own vessel, alongside a handful of investors back on shore who had never set foot on her deck and never intended to, content to collect their portion of the profit at the far end of a successful crossing. There was the cargo, owned separately again, often insured by yet another party entirely, with the insurance rates set according to the ship's age, her captain's reputation, the season, and the notorious unpredictability of the route she intended to take. A freight contract bound a captain to deliver a specific cargo to a specific port by a reasonably specific time, and failure to do so, through delay, through damage, through anything short of an act of God generous enough to satisfy an insurer's lawyers, could cost him not just his fee but his name, in a trade where a captain's name was very nearly his only asset. You can feel, if you sit with it, how much quiet pressure sat behind even a routine departure. Every barrel loaded below decks represented someone's money, sitting on someone's nerve, riding out across water that owed nobody anything. A captain absorbed all of that anxiety and was expected to show none of it, to stand on his own quarterdeck looking exactly as composed as the ship itself would look weeks later to a man named Morehouse staring at her across an empty stretch of sea. It's worth remembering that stillness now, while it's only a financial stillness, a matter of contracts and casks and shared risk. It will mean something rather different to you later. Which brings us back, gently, to the two men themselves, because it was in this world of shared risk and overlapping acquaintance that Briggs and Morehouse actually crossed paths in the days just before both of their ships left New York. The record that survives is modest about it. No dramatic conversation, no foreboding toast, nothing you could hang a legend on cleanly. But it does agree that the two captains dined together in the city before their respective departures, two men in the same trade out of the same rough world of Nova Scotia yards and New York piers, talking presumably about cargo and weather and whatever else men in their position talked about over an evening meal before going their separate ways to sea. Their ships would leave port only days apart, bound roughly the same direction, across roughly the same ocean. Neither man, sitting at that table, had any reason at all to think that one of them would spend the rest of his life being asked to explain what he found. For now, though, we should go back a little further than that dinner, back to the very beginning of the ship herself, before she carried Briggs, before she carried Sarah, before she had even earned the name by which this whole story would eventually be told. You do not need to remember any of this to follow where it leads, but it helps to start at the water's edge, in a place most people have never heard of and never will. Spencer's Island sits on the Nova Scotia shore of the Bay of Fundy, where the tide does something almost violent. It rises and falls with a force that has shaped the whole economy of the coast around it, filling and emptying the harbor twice a day like a lung. It was here, on a beach shaped by that tide, that a group of local men decided to build a ship. You would have known the yard by its smell before you saw it. The resin sweetness of cut spruce, the sharper bite of tar heating in an iron pot, the damp mineral smell of a beach at low water. Had you walked down toward the shore that year, you would have found a hull taking shape under open sky, its ribs standing up out of the sand like the bones of something enormous and patient waiting to be given skin. The timber came from the forests just behind the shore. Nothing exotic, nothing shipped in from far away, just the spruce and birch that grew thick along that stretch of coast, felled by men who worked in the cold months when the sap was down and the wood cut cleaner. The builder was a man named Joshua Dewis, and it was Dewis and a handful of local partners who put up the money and staked their names to the project, the way small shipbuilding communities across that coast did constantly in those years, one hull at a time, one investment shared out among neighbors who knew each other's boats better than they knew each other's houses. She was a modest vessel by the standards of the age, a two-masted brigantine not built for speed or glamour but for the plain, unglamorous work of carrying cargo wherever cargo needed to go. And she went into the water carrying a name that would not survive her. They called her the Amazon. If you had stood on that beach for her launch, you might have expected nothing more than the ordinary ceremony. A bottle broken, a cheer, a hull sliding down the ways into water that had been waiting for it since the first plank went up. Instead, according to the accounts that survive from Spencer's Island, something went wrong almost immediately. The registration of the new vessel required an official to come and take her measurements, to certify her tonnage and her lines for the paperwork that would let her sail as a documented ship. That official, by most tellings, was taken ill during the very visit meant to mark her beginning and died within days. It is the kind of detail that sits oddly in a factual record, small, almost domestic, and yet impossible to leave out because of what came after it. What came after it was worse. On her first attempt to actually go to sea under sail, the new ship collided with fishing equipment in the bay, and in the confusion of the moment, drove her bowsprit into the cabin of a house standing near the shore. No one part of that is remarkable on its own. Small craft strike obstacles, damage gets repaired, ships go on to long, uneventful careers after far worse beginnings. But taken together in a community small enough that everyone would have heard about all of it within a week, it left a mark. The mark deepened during her first real voyage. She was placed under the command of her first captain, a man named Robert McClellan, and by the record that survives, McClellan fell ill almost as soon as he took her out and died within days of assuming command. Some accounts say of pneumonia, contracted in the damp of the passage. You do not need to decide, lying here in the dark, whether any of this means something. It is simply what happened, set down plainly in registries and local memory, the way any small ship's early service might be set down, except that this particular ship kept collecting these moments the way some hulls collect barnacles. A new captain took her over, a man named John Nutting Parker, and under his command she crossed to the English Channel, and there, in the crowded shipping lanes near the Strait of Dover, she collided with another vessel, damaging her hull badly enough that Parker, by most tellings, was so shaken by the run of misfortune attached to his new ship that he gave up command of her not long after. You can almost picture the scene without needing a single invented detail to fill it in. A captain standing at the rail of a battered ship in a foreign port, done not because the sea had beaten him, but because the ship herself had started to feel, to the men who sailed her, like something worth walking away from. But a keel laid down in a small yard on the Bay of Fundy is never the whole of a ship's story. A hull can survive a difficult berth and go on to decades of forgettable, competent service the way most ships eventually do. So what happened once this one found her footing at sea, once the early run of trouble had passed and she settled, as ships often do, into simply doing her job? For a stretch of years, she did exactly that. Carried cargo across ordinary routes, changed hands the way small trading vessels always did, passed from one merchant owner to another without anything worth recording happening to her at all. It is worth pausing on that because it is easy, once you know how her story ends, to imagine a ship marked from birth for something strange. She was not. For most of her working life, she was simply a brigantine doing brigantine's work. Forgettable in exactly the way a listener drifting towards sleep might forget the details of this very paragraph by morning, and that would be perfectly fine. The trouble came again in the autumn when she ran hard aground during a storm near Cape Breton at a place called Cow Bay, and was driven onto rocks badly enough that her owners declared her a wreck beyond economical repair. That should, by any reasonable measure, have been the end of her. Ships condemned as wrecks in that period were usually broken up where they lay, stripped of anything useful, left to the tide. Instead, she was purchased in that ruined state by a salvor, and what happened next quietly reshaped everything about her. An American mariner and shipwright named Richard W. Haynes bought the wreck, had her raised and repaired, and, in a move that was not entirely legal under the shipping regulations of the day, since American law restricted the registry of foreign-built vessels, attempted to register her as an American ship anyway, a decision that would later cause its own tangle of legal trouble. She passed soon after into the hands of a New York consortium, was rebuilt more thoroughly at a yard in that city, lengthened and refitted until she was, in almost every practical sense, a different vessel wearing the memory of the old one. It was at this point, once the paperwork and the ownership had settled into something like order, that she was given the name history would remember her by. She became the Mary Celeste. You can let that resettling wash over you the way the tide moved twice a day through Spencer's Island, in, out, in again, each cycle erasing a little more of what came before. The ship that emerged from the New York yard carried none of the men who had built her, none of the captains who had briefly commanded and then abandoned her, nothing of the Bay of Fundy at all except the bones under her new planking. She belonged now to a company called J.H., Winchester and Company, and in time, one of the men who would come to hold a share in her ownership and eventually her command was a careful, God-fearing sea captain from Massachusetts named Benjamin Briggs. It is to him and to the ship as she stood when he first walked her deck that this story turns next. But he did not walk her deck as a stranger to that kind of vessel. Briggs came from a family that seemed to have salt water running instead of blood. His father, a sea captain, his brothers, sea captains. The family home in Marion, Massachusetts, more often empty of its men than not, all of them off somewhere on the Atlantic or beyond it. Benjamin himself had been at sea since he was barely more than a boy, working his way up through the ranks the slow, unglamorous way until command of his own vessels became simply what he did, the way another man might practice law or keep a shop. By the time the Mary Celeste came into his life, he held a small share in her ownership alongside his interest in command, which was common enough arrangement for a captain of his standing, a man invested, quite literally, in the ship succeeding. What he did not yet know, standing on her deck for the first time, appraising her lines with a professional eye, was what cargo she would carry on the voyage that would make her name outlast every ship built that year on the Bay of Fundy. You would have known him by his posture before you knew his name, that particular stillness some sea captains carry, as if the deck under their boots were no different from a church floor. Benjamin Briggs came from Wareham, Massachusetts, a town built so entirely around ships and the men who sailed them that it would have been stranger for a boy there to stay ashore than to go to sea. His father had commanded vessels, his brothers commanded vessels. The Briggs name, up and down that stretch of coast, meant a captain's family the way another surname might mean a family of millers or blacksmiths, and Benjamin grew into the trade the way you might grow into a language spoken at your own kitchen table, absorbed before it was ever formally taught. But growing into a trade and mastering it are not quite the same thing, and it is worth sitting with what people actually said about him, because none of it describes a reckless man. Sober, religious in the plain New England way that meant Sunday services and a Bible read without performance. Exacting. A word that turns up again and again in the accounts of men who sailed under him or alongside him, and it is not a word sailors hand out lightly to captains they merely tolerate. He did not drink at a time when very few captains could say the same, and he ran his ships accordingly without the disorder that a bottle in the captain's cabin could bring to an entire crew. If you had signed on with him, you would have known within the first watch what kind of vessel you were sailing. Quiet, orderly, run by a man who checked the same knot twice, not because he doubted the sailor who tied it, but because doubting was simply how he was built. He married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, herself from a seafaring family, which meant she understood exactly what she was marrying. The long absences, the letters that arrived months late or not at all, the particular loneliness of a captain's wife who spends half her married life reading tide charts instead of a husband's face. They had 2 children. A son, Arthur, who by the time of this voyage was old enough to be left in the care of his grandmother back on land, already accustomed to a father who came and went with the seasons. And a daughter, Sophia Matilda, not yet old enough for that kind of arrangement to feel bearable to either parent, small enough still that Sarah could not imagine the long crossing without her close by, and Briggs, it seems, could not imagine it either. This is the detail that changes the whole shape of what follows, and it is worth letting it settle before the story moves any further. This was not simply a captain taking his ship to sea with a hold full of cargo and a crew of hired hands. Sarah came aboard. Sophia came aboard, not yet 2 years old, small enough to be carried up the gangway in someone's arms rather than to climb it herself. A voyage that on paper was a commercial crossing, barrels loaded, a manifest signed, a route charted toward a foreign port, was also quietly, underneath all of that, a family bringing its whole self onto the water. If your own household has ever packed itself onto a train or a ferry together, all your lives briefly reduced to what fits into a cabin the size of a closet, you will know something of what that crossing must have felt like from the inside, before anyone had reason to think of it as anything but ordinary. There is nothing you need to hold on to yet in any of this. No thread to trace forward, no detail to keep pinned in your mind against what comes later. Just a family, boarding a ship, the way families have boarded ships for as long as there have been ships to board. But what does a captain actually do in the weeks before he trusts his own wife and daughter to a hold full of cargo and an ocean that owes nobody anything? That question is where the more practical part of this story begins, and it is worth spending time inside it, because Briggs's care in these weeks tells you almost everything about the kind of disappearance this eventually became. By the time the Mary Celeste came into his hands, Briggs held a part ownership in her, a common enough arrangement, as you'll recall, for a captain of his standing, but one that meant something different to him personally than it might have to a hired master with no stake beyond his wages. A man who owns a share of the ship he commands does not treat her casually. Every seam that leaks is his own money leaking. Every delay in port is a delay against his own investment as much as his employer's. So before this crossing, Briggs went over her the way you might go over a house you were about to move your whole family into, not glancing but checking. Her rigging, her pumps, her hold, freshly fitted for the cargo she was about to carry. He was, by every account that survives him, not a man who trusted a job simply because someone told him it was finished. Provisioning took the same care. Water enough for the crossing, stores enough to keep a small crew fed through weeks of open ocean, and beyond the practical necessities, whatever small comforts a captain could arrange for a wife and a child who would be living in a cabin barely larger than a modest bedroom for the length of the voyage. And there was the crew itself, smaller than you might expect for a vessel her size, 7 men beyond Briggs and his family, chosen with the same deliberate hand he'd used on everything else. A first mate he trusted enough to marry into his own extended family. A second mate. A steward to cook and keep the cabin in order. 4 more hands, seamen with steady reputations, brought aboard not at random from whichever tavern happened to be nearest the dock, but selected, as far as the record allows us to say, with the same exacting eye Briggs turned on his rigging and his pumps, and his. If your eyes have already started to close, let them. There is nothing urgent happening here, only a careful man doing careful things, the way careful men do, in the last ordinary days before a voyage nobody involved had any reason to fear. What all of this adds up to before a single rope was cast off is a ship that should have been among the least mysterious in her fleet that season. Not undermanned, not poorly provisioned, not commanded by some overconfident young officer eager to prove himself against the weather. Briggs was, by every measure his contemporaries left behind, precisely the kind of captain insurers liked to underwrite and other captains liked to sail near. A known quantity, cautious to the point of habit, a man who by all appearances had already accounted for whatever the ocean might throw at him. And that, in the end, is what makes what follows so difficult to sit with, even now, even at this distance, even telling it slowly in the dark the way this story deserves to be told. A careful man, a trusted ship, checked and rechecked. A wife and small daughter brought aboard not out of necessity, but out of love, because the thought of the distance between them for so many weeks was worse than the thought of the crossing itself. All of it arranged, provisioned, inspected, and ready. Everything, in other words, that care and preparation could account for. What waited in the days ahead was not a failure of Briggs's judgment. It was something else entirely, something no inspection could have caught, and it begins, as so much of this story does, with an ordinary cargo being loaded onto an ordinary morning in a harbor that had no idea what it was about to send out to sea. But cargo, even ordinary cargo, has its own character, and this particular cargo would come to matter more than anyone loading it that morning could have guessed. The Mary Celeste was not carrying grain or cotton or the kind of freight a stevedore could handle without a second thought. She was loading barrels of denatured alcohol bound for Genoa, meant for fortifying wine, industrial spirits, not for drinking, sealed and stacked deep in her hold until the space smelled less like a ship than like a distillery. You would have felt it before you saw it, that sharpness in the air along the pier, sailors wrinkling their noses as barrel after barrel went down into the dark. Briggs would have known the cargo's temperament the way he knew everything else about his ship. That alcohol shifts, that it breathes with changes in temperature, that barrels not perfectly sealed can weep their contents slowly into a hold stale air. Whether he gave this any particular worry that morning, no record says. What the record does say is simpler and stranger for its simplicity. The loading went smoothly, the manifest was signed, and nothing about it seemed to anyone standing on that dock like the beginning of a mystery that would outlive every person watching it happen. The crew came aboard in the days before departure, and if you had been standing at the rail as they climbed up one by one with their sea chests over their shoulders, you would have seen nothing to distinguish this crew from 100 others working the same wharves that week. That ordinariness is, in its way, the whole point. Benjamin Briggs did not hire strangers on a whim. He hired men whose names came recommended, whose papers were in order, whose reputations, such as reputations existed for merchant sailors passing through New York, were steady rather than remarkable. A steady reputation was exactly what he wanted. He was not looking for adventure in his crew, he was looking for men who would do their watches, mind the pumps, and not give him cause to write home about trouble. The first mate was a man named Albert Richardson, and if the record is thin on most of what passed through that harbour in the winter of 1872, it is a little less thin on him because he had sailed with Briggs before and was, by all accounts that survive, trusted the way a captain trusts very few men under him. You might picture him older than he was. First mates in the stories we tell ourselves are always grizzled, but Richardson was a young man, still capable, and known to Briggs personally, which on a ship this size mattered more than any list of qualifications. A captain and mate who already understood each other's rhythms could run a vessel with fewer words between them, and fewer words between the men in charge tends to mean fewer surprises for everyone else aboard. The second mate was Andrew Gilling, and beneath him came the ship's cook and steward, a man named Edward Head, whose job it was to keep the small galley running and the meals arriving whatever the weather chose to do. And then there were 4 more hands, ordinary sailors, signed on for the crossing, and here the record does something interesting. It tells us, with more confidence than it tells us almost anything else about this voyage, that these 4 men were Germans, and that they came aboard with the kind of quiet, unremarkable competence that made shipping agents recommend them again and again. Their names have survived too: Volkert Lorenzen, his brother Boz, Arian Martens, and Gottlieb Gutschard. You do not need to hold on to any of those names tonight. What matters is simpler than names. It is the picture of 8 men, a captain, a mate, a cook, and 5 sailors, all of them chosen with the same unhurried care Briggs brought to everything else. None of them troublesome, none of them strangers to the sea, all of them about to vanish from every record that was ever kept of them except this one. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, the way you might sit with something in the dark without needing to solve it. These men had families somewhere, ports they called home, reasons for taking this particular berth on this particular ship rather than any of the dozen others tied up along the same stretch of waterfront. None of that made it into the account books. What made it into the account books was only this: names, wages, a manifest, a date. If your eyes are already closing, that is exactly the right way to hold this part of the story. Lightly, the way the record itself holds it. A handful of names in a ledger and nothing more. But a crew of working men was not the whole of what stepped aboard that ship in the days before she sailed. There was another passenger, one whose presence changes the entire shape of what would later be found, and to understand her, you have to picture something Briggs himself would have carried with a different kind of care than he gave the alcohol in the hold. Sarah Briggs came aboard with her own belongings, and with her came the couple's young daughter, Sophia, not yet old enough to remember any of this later, though she would spend the rest of her life answering questions about a voyage she was too small to recall. Sarah had made this kind of crossing before. She was, by the standards of captains' wives in that era, an experienced sailor herself, someone who understood what a cabin needed to feel less like a box floating on the ocean and more like a place a person could actually live for weeks at a stretch. And so what she carried aboard was not simply luggage. It was the furniture of an ordinary domestic life, miniaturized and packed for sea. Among the things she brought was a melodeon, a small reed organ, the kind that could sit against a cabin wall and still leave room to move around it. And if you have never seen one, picture something between a harmonium and a very serious accordion worked by foot pedals, capable of filling a small room with sound that was, by the accounts of people who owned them, more mournful than merry. She brought it, most likely, the way anyone brings a piano into a house they intend to make a home. Not because the crossing demanded music, but because a life without it felt smaller than she wanted her days at sea to be. Alongside it went her sewing things, needles, thread, scraps of cloth, whatever small machine or basket she used to mend and make clothes for herself and for Sophia, who at that age went through clothing the way small children always have, faster than anyone can keep up with. These are the kinds of details that only survive by accident, and it is worth noticing quietly why they survived at all. A melodeon and a sewing basket are not the sort of thing that make it into a captain's log or a shipping manifest. They survive because someone, a relative, a friend, a person writing a letter to another person, mentioned them once, in passing, the way you might mention what your own family carries from house to house without ever thinking it worth writing down. Only afterward, once this ship's name had become something people wanted to ask questions about, did anyone think to remember what Sarah Briggs had brought with her? And by then the memory had passed through enough hands that you have to hold it the way you'd hold any old, well-worn thing, grateful it survived at all, but careful not to lean on it too hard. What that melodeon and that sewing basket give you, more than any fact about tonnage or cargo, is the shape of the life this family expected to be living for the weeks ahead. Not adventure, not danger, an ordinary crossing, made a little more bearable by having your own instrument to play in the evenings and your own needle and thread close at hand for the 100 small repairs a household generates without even trying. You can imagine the cabin taking shape around these objects the way any room takes shape around the things a family decides matter enough to carry with them. A little crowded, a little particular, entirely theirs. The last days before departure passed in the unremarkable rhythm that precedes almost every ocean crossing in history. The kind of rhythm nobody thinks to record because nobody expects it to matter. Ropes were checked, water was taken on. Sarah Briggs would have spent some of those hours arranging the cabin exactly as she wanted it, finding a place for the melodeon where it wouldn't shift in a rolling sea, tucking Sophia's small things into whatever corners a child's belongings end up in a space that size. Briggs himself moved between the ship and the shipping offices, signing the last of the paperwork, satisfying himself that the cargo was secure and the crew accounted for. Richardson would have overseen the final loading from the deck, the way a good first mate does, keeping half an eye on the men and half an eye on the captain, ready to be wherever he was needed before anyone had to ask. If you had walked that quay in the last hours before the ship slipped her lines, none of it would have looked like anything worth remembering. That is, in the end, the strange gift and the strange burden of this story. That its beginning is so thoroughly ordinary that no one thought to note it as anything else. A captain loading barrels he trusted less than he trusted almost any other cargo he had carried. A wife bringing her music and her needles aboard for a family crossing. A crew of steady, unremarkable men climbing the gangway with their sea chests, glad of the work. Nothing about the departure itself, when it finally came, would give anyone standing on that dock the smallest reason to imagine that this particular sailing, out of the hundreds leaving New York that season, was the one people would still be asking questions about more than a century and a half later, the one that would leave the harbor whole and true, and be found again on the open ocean with everyone who boarded her that week nowhere to be found at all. The Mary Celeste cleared the Narrows on the 7th of November, 2 days later than Briggs had planned, held at anchor by a wind that had come up hard out of the northeast and showed no sign of tiring. If you had been standing on the Staten Island shore that week, watching the anchorage where she waited, you would have seen a harbor full of ships doing the same patient thing, sails furled, hulls swinging slowly on their cables, captains below decks reading the sky through cabin windows and deciding, morning after morning, that today was still not the day. Briggs was not a man who took chances with weather he didn't have to take. He had his wife aboard, and his daughter, not yet 2 years old, and whatever urgency the charterers in New York felt about their cargo of alcohol reaching Genoa, it was not going to move him out through a gale simply to keep a schedule. So the ship sat, and the crew found small tasks to fill the waiting, lines coiled and coiled again, the galley stove tested, sails checked for a chafe that wasn't there. You do not have to hold on to any of this. It is only the ordinary texture of a delay, the kind every sailing ship of that century absorbed without comment, and it would have vanished from memory entirely if nothing else had happened afterward. But something did happen afterward. And so this particular delay, these 2 unremarkable days at anchor, are among the last details anyone can reconstruct about the Mary Celeste with any confidence at all. On the morning the wind finally eased, Briggs gave the order, and the ship went out past Sandy Hook under full sail, riding low with her cargo, the coastline of America falling away behind her the way it fell away behind 100 other departures that same season. Sarah Briggs, from what little survives of her, seems to have kept up her habit of writing home. A letter posted before the delay mentions Sophia's fondness for the ship's cat, mentions the crew as quiet and capable, mentions nothing at all of foreboding, because there was nothing to be foreboding about. You are standing, in a sense, at the very last point in this story where everything is still simply what it appears to be. A family, a cargo, a competent captain, an ocean waiting to be crossed the way oceans had always been crossed. Of the crossing itself, the record that survives is thin, which is only to be expected. A ship's logbook of that era recorded position, weather, and the barest administrative notes. Nothing of conversation, nothing of mood, nothing that would let you sit at that cabin table with them, though you might imagine it anyway, the lamp swinging gently with the roll of the ship. Sarah's letters half finished, Sophia already asleep in a berth built into the cabin wall. What the log does preserve in Briggs's own steady hand and later in his mate's is a record of a crossing that went, by every measure available, entirely as expected. Position was taken and noted. Weather was logged as weather always was. Winds noted by direction and strength. Seas noted as moderate or rough, nothing that reads even now as anything other than ordinary Atlantic sailing for the season. If your eyes are already growing heavy, this is a good place to let them close because nothing in these particular weeks asks to be remembered in detail. It is simply a ship crossing an ocean, doing what ships did. The small rhythms of that life would have gone on beneath all of it, unrecorded because they never needed recording. A watch changing at the ship's bell. A meal passed up from the galley in whatever weather allowed it. The mate, Albert Richardson, keeping the log in Briggs's absence with the same careful hand, because that was the arrangement on a ship where the captain trusted his officer enough to leave the record in his charge. 4 sailors from the German ports, men whose names survive in the crew list and almost nowhere else, going about the sailing of a 2-masted brigantine with the unhurried competence of men who had done this work on other ships, under other captains, and expected to do it again. You would not have found anything aboard that ship in those first days out from New York that marked her as different from any other vessel making the same crossing that autumn. But while the Mary Celeste settled into her Atlantic routine, what was happening back in the harbor she had just left? Roughly a week after Briggs took his ship out past Sandy Hook, another vessel made ready at a New York pier, not far from where the Mary Celeste herself had loaded her cargo of alcohol. Her name was the Dei Gratia, and her captain was a man named David Morehouse, a name that belongs in this story from here on because it will not leave it again. Morehouse and Briggs knew each other, not as close friends exactly, but as men of the same trade who moved in the same small world of transatlantic captains, who had dined together at least once before either ship sailed, by most accounts sharing a meal in port in the days just before departure. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, quietly, the way you might sit with any detail that only becomes strange in hindsight. Two captains, acquainted, perhaps even fond of one another in the loose way sailors are fond of men they meet only a few times a year, eating together in New York while their ships waited nearby, neither of them able to know what the ocean had arranged for them to find. The Dei Gratia carried petroleum, not alcohol, bound like the Mary Celeste for a European port, and she left New York on the 15th of November, some 8 days behind. Her course, as Morehouse laid it out, followed much the same track across the Atlantic that any captain bound for the Mediterranean from an American port would have chosen that season, a line that took advantage of the prevailing winds, that passed in time somewhere near the Azores, the same scatter of islands that the Mary Celeste herself would pass in her own crossing. Two ships then, on the same ocean, on courses that converged not by any plan either captain made, but simply because the Atlantic in November offered a handful of sensible routes, and both men, trained in the same tradition, chose one of them. You do not need to hold the geography of it precisely. It is enough to know that the sea, in its indifferent way, was drawing two crews toward the same patch of open water, one of them entirely unaware that anything was wrong, the other not yet aware that they would be the ones to find it. Aboard the Mary Celeste, the days went on the way Atlantic days went. The log continued to be kept, position after position, the small disciplined record of a ship's progress that Briggs and Richardson between them maintained without a gap, without an irregularity, without anything in the handwriting or the phrasing that reads, even to investigators who examined it obsessively afterward, as anything other than calm. The alcohol in the hold rode as cargo of that kind always rode, secured and unremarkable. Sophia would have had her small routines on deck when the weather allowed it, watched over by her mother or by one of the crew, the ship's cat somewhere nearby, the whole small floating household going about its business several hundred miles from any coast. And then on the 25th of November, someone aboard the Mary Celeste made the last entry that anyone would ever read in her log, a position taken and noted in the ordinary way, placing the ship near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, with nothing in the wording to suggest that the person writing it felt anything but the mild, practiced attention of a man doing a task he had done every day of the voyage. There is no warning in it. There is no sign of trouble, no note of a leak, no note of a storm, no note of a single thing that might explain what would be found only days later. It simply ends there, mid-crossing, mid-routine, the last dated line in a record that had until that point been entirely unremarkable. And it is that very ordinariness, that last calm entry giving no hint of what came next, that the Dei Gratia's crew would soon sail directly toward without knowing it. What the log does not say is what happened in the days after that entry, and it is worth pausing on the shape of that silence rather than rushing past it. 10 days would pass before anyone laid eyes on the Mary Celeste again. 10 days in which the ship continued somehow under some hand or none to hold her course well enough to remain a working vessel rather than a wreck. You are not meant to solve this yet. There is nothing to solve. Somewhere ahead of her now, the Dei Gratia was closing the distance, Morehouse at his own charts, entirely unaware that the calm little brigantine he'd shared a meal's conversation about was already sailing empty toward him. The Dei Gratia had left New York a little over a week behind her, riding lower in the water with barrels of petroleum stacked and lashed below, bound for the same grey stretch of Atlantic and the same eventual harbour at Gibraltar. You would not have thought, watching the two ships take on cargo at their separate piers, that they were bound for anything but ordinary, uneventful crossings, the kind that fill a logbook with weather and little else. But the sea that autumn was arranging something quieter than either captain could have guessed, drawing two lines across the same stretch of chart until they very nearly touched. David Morehouse commanded her, a man Briggs had known well enough to share a supper and a slow conversation before both ships sailed. The kind of evening two captains spend comparing routes and cargoes and the small gossip of the shipping trade. There was nothing unusual in that. Captains crossing paths in port did this all the time, trading news over a plate of food before returning to their separate decks and their separate weather. Neither man had any reason that evening to think of the other again until they compared notes on arrival. If you had been sitting at that table with them, you would have heard nothing more than shop talk, the price of freight, the temper of the Atlantic in early winter, an anecdote about a difficult crew. Nothing in the words themselves would have told you that one of these men was about to sail directly into the other's unraveling. The Dei Gratia held a course further to the south and east than the Mary Celeste had taken, and for most of the crossing the two ships were separated by enough open water that neither could have expected to sight the other at all. That is worth sitting with for a moment in the dark, without needing to hold on to it. The ocean is enormous, and the fact that these two paths converged owes more to the ordinary geometry of the shipping lanes than to anything stranger. Ships bound from American ports to Gibraltar tend to converge naturally as they approach the Azores, funneled by wind and current into a narrower channel of sea than the vastness of the crossing might suggest. It was there, in that funnel, that the story turns. The day was clear when the lookout aboard the Dei Gratia first called down that there was a sail on the horizon, and for a good while nobody thought much of it. A sail was nothing remarkable in that stretch of ocean. Ships passed each other at a distance most days, each too far off to be more than a smudge of white against the grey, each continuing about its own business without a second glance. What drew a second glance, and then a third, was the way this particular sail was carrying herself. She was yawing, swinging off her line and drifting back onto it in a slow, uneven rhythm that no properly worked ship makes when there is a hand at the wheel. Her canvas was set loosely, badly, some of it slack and luffing where it ought to have been drawing taut, as though whoever had raised it had done so in a hurry and never returned to trim it properly since. Morehouse raised his glass and studied her for a long while, and you can imagine the particular quality of that looking, not alarmed yet, only puzzled. The kind of attention a sailor gives to something that doesn't quite sit right without yet being wrong enough to name. He would have watched the bow swing, watched it hold, watched it swing again, and felt the small, cold curiosity that comes from watching a thing behave against its nature. A ship under full sail does not simply wander. Someone is always meant to be answering for her course, and this one seemed to be answering to no one at all. But what does it actually take to turn a sailor's puzzlement into real unease out on the open water, hours before there is a single fact to hang it on? It takes time, mostly, and the slow accumulation of things that ought to have happened and didn't. The Dei Gratia altered course to close the distance, and as the gap between the two ships narrowed, Morehouse gave the order to run up signal flags, the ordinary courtesy exchanged between passing vessels. A greeting, an offer to report positions, nothing more than the sea's own etiquette. There was no answer. He tried again. Still nothing. At that distance, a lack of response could still mean many harmless things. An inattentive watch, a captain occupied below, flags simply unseen against the glare of the afternoon. You would have told yourself the same, standing at that rail, reaching for every ordinary explanation before allowing yourself the uneasy one. As the two ships drew nearer still, the small reassurances began to fall away one by one. There was no smoke rising from her galley stovepipe, no answering wave from anyone at her rail, no figure crossing her deck to acknowledge that another vessel had come within hailing distance. A sailing ship in open ocean, however short-handed, will nearly always show some sign of a living crew going about its business. A man at the wheel, if nothing else, a lookout aloft, someone drawn by simple curiosity to the rail to see who else shared this stretch of water with them. This ship showed none of it. She simply carried on with her uneven, wandering gait, sails half drawing, half slack, entirely indifferent to the vessel now shadowing her. Morehouse ordered his men to hail her directly, and you can hear it if you let yourself, the human voice thrown out across open water into a silence with nothing behind it to answer back. He called again. The only response was the water itself, the creak of rigging, the small, ordinary sounds of a ship carrying on exactly as she would with no one aboard to notice whether anyone called to her at all. It is a particular kind of stillness, that one, not the silence of an empty room, which at least has walls to hold it, but the silence of an active thing, sails filled, timbers working, moving forward through the sea with every outward appearance of purpose, and none of the person behind it that purpose implies. If your eyes are already closing, let this part settle over you gently rather than sharply. There was no violence in what the Dei Gratia's crew were watching, only absence, patient and complete. It was the mate, Oliver Deveau, who first studied her closely enough through the glass to make out the lettering across her stern, the paint a little weathered, but the name still perfectly legible in the afternoon light. He would have read it once, and then again, the way you reread a sentence that doesn't make sense the first time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something more plausible. They did not rearrange. The name stayed exactly what it was. Word passed quickly to Morehouse, and whatever composure a captain keeps by habit must have taken a genuine test in that moment. Because the ship drifting empty ahead of his own was not simply some stranger's vessel lost to whatever misfortune the sea deals out. It was the Mary Celeste. It was Briggs's ship, the same captain who had sat across the table from him only days before, speaking with the particular calm of a man confident in his crossing, his cargo, and his crew. Morehouse had last pictured that ship as a set of cheerful details from an evening's conversation. A captain's wife aboard, a small daughter somewhere below decks, a cargo of industrial alcohol bound quietly for Genoa. Now she sat in his own glass, sails slack, decks empty, yawing gently across the current with no one anywhere in sight to explain how she had come to be that way. There is no record of exactly what passed through Morehouse in that first long minute of recognition, and it would serve the story poorly to invent one. What the accounts agree on is simpler and somehow stranger for its plainness. He gave the order to close with her, to lower a boat, and to find out, as calmly as men can manage such things, what in the world had become of the ship, and the captain, and everyone who had sailed with him. Deveau was chosen to lead the boarding party, along with two other men from the Dei Gratia's small crew, and the boat that carried them across the gap between the ships must have felt, to whoever sat at the oars, like the longest short distance any of them had ever rowed. You would have watched the hull grow larger with every stroke, the strange, yawing rhythm of her now visible not as a smudge but as a real and physical motion, the whole ship leaning and righting herself with no one at the wheel to explain it. There would have been a moment coming alongside when someone had to reach up and take hold of her rail, committing to whatever waited above without knowing yet what that would be. The climb up her side was short. What they found once they stood on her deck was longer than any of them could have expected. The climb up her side was short. What they found once they stood on her deck was longer than any of them could have expected. Oliver Deveau went first, the way a first mate is supposed to, and the two men who followed him, John Wright and a third hand from the Dei Gratia, sent along in case there was work to be done, came up behind him more slowly, the way anyone would climb onto a deck that had been calling out to no one for who knew how long. If you had been the one to put your hand on that rail, you would have felt how slick it was. Not with spray thrown up in the last hour, but with something older. Water that had been sitting there long enough to find its own low places and stay in them. The deck was awash, several inches deep in places, sloshing gently from rail to rail with the ship's own uneasy motion, and your boots would have gone into it before you had even decided to step forward. The wheel stood untouched. That is the detail that seems to have struck Deveau first, or at least the one he returned to afterward, because a ship's wheel left to itself is not a small thing. It is the one place on a vessel where you expect, almost instinctively, to find a hand, and finding none there does something to the mind that is hard to shake off. It was spinning loosely with the swell, turning a little this way and a little back, answering to the sea instead of to a helmsman, and the binnacle beside it had been knocked or had simply fallen, its glass broken, the compass inside it tilted out of true. You would have looked at that wheel the way you look at an open door in a house you were told was empty, not frightened yet, but no longer entirely at ease either. Above their heads, the rigging told its own version of the story, and it did not agree with itself. Some of the sails were set, drawing what little they could from a wind that had mostly left them, while others had been taken in properly, furled and secured the way a careful crew leaves them when foul weather is expected. Still others hung in rags torn loose from their yards, flogging softly against the masts with a sound that must have carried oddly across that much water. A slack, papery sound, nothing like the crack of canvas working hard. It was the kind of rigging you would see on a ship that had been fought over, sail by sail, through a storm that came on faster than anyone could answer it. And yet the deck beneath it showed no sign of any such fight. No rope was cut in a hurry and left where it fell. No block or spar lay smashed across the planking. Whatever had happened here, it had happened without leaving the marks a storm usually leaves. There is nothing you need to hold on to in that image if it is already starting to blur. The wheel, the water, the ragged sail, because it will come round again, gently, before the story is finished. For now, it is enough to know that 3 men stood on a deck that felt, in Devoe's own words afterward, entirely wrong, though nothing on it could yet explain why. But what does it actually take to search a ship like this, room by room, when you do not yet know what you are looking for, and every door you open might be the one that explains everything or explains nothing at all? It takes, as it turned out, patience more than courage, though courage was not absent from it either. Devoe went below first, into the companionway that led down from the afterdeck, and the light would have changed the moment he did, the wide grey daylight of the open sea, narrowing suddenly into the close brown light of a captain's cabin below decks, the kind of light that makes you lower your voice without deciding to. If you had followed him down those steps yourself, you would have smelled the ship before you saw much of it. Damp wood, bilge water, the sweetish reek of the 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol sitting in the hold, 9 of which, it would later be found, had somehow been broached and had leaked into the space around them. That smell alone might have been enough to unsettle a man standing in a small, dark room, not knowing yet whether he was alone in it. He was. That was the first and most persistent fact that the search kept returning. Room after room, and no one in any of them. The captain's cabin held Benjamin Briggs's things, much as you would expect a careful man to have left them. Charts still on the table, a sword under the bed in its scabbard, personal effects in their place. Nothing overturned, nothing ransacked. In the mate's cabin, the crew's own belongings sat undisturbed as well, oilskins hung where they had been hung, sea chests closed. If you had opened those chests yourself, hoping to find some sign of what the men had taken with them in their hurry, you would have found instead exactly the opposite kind of evidence, that they had taken almost nothing, that whatever haste carried them off the ship had not been the kind that stops to pack. There was a sewing machine in the cabin that had belonged, it seems, to Sarah Briggs, sitting exactly where a woman on a long crossing might have left it. A reel of thread still fitted to it as though she had only just set it down. There is something about an object like that, small and domestic and entirely undamaged, that unsettles more than any wreckage could, and Devoe seems to have felt it too, because he mentioned it specifically in his account afterward. One small detail among the larger emptiness that had lodged itself in his memory. They went on through the ship the way you would move through a house you were checking after a storm, methodical because the alternative was worse. The galley, where the cooking fire had gone out, but the pots were still in their places. The crew's quarters forward, each bunk as it had been left. The hold itself, where the barrels sat in their rows, most of them undisturbed, a few showing the damage that had let their contents seep out into the bilge. Nowhere was there a body. Nowhere was there blood, or a struck-out plank, or a sign that violence of any human kind had passed through these spaces. The one thing missing, in the end, was not a person, but a boat. The ship's single yawl, which should have hung from davits at her stern, was gone, along with its lines, cut or unfastened in a way that suggested deliberate lowering rather than a wave tearing it free. If your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in this account of empty rooms, that is exactly the right way to hear it. There is no violence waiting at the end of this search, only absence, room after room of it, and the strange calm of a ship that seems to have been left rather than lost. By the time Devoe came back up onto that awash and silent deck, he had already begun to form the sense that would stay with him for the rest of his life and would be repeated, in one form or another, at every hearing and inquiry that followed. This was not a ship that had been struck down. It was not a ship whose people had died where they stood. It was, as far as he could tell, a ship that her own crew had chosen to leave, quickly, and for some reason that seemed urgent enough to abandon a sound and floating vessel, yet not so urgent or not so violent that they had stopped to take their belongings or to leave behind any mark of what had frightened them into going. He rowed back to the De Gratia to tell Morehouse what he had found, and it is worth pausing on what that conversation between the two of them must have been, out there on the water with an unmanned ship sitting behind them, her sails still half set to a wind she no longer needed. Morehouse had known Briggs. The two men had dined together only days before the Mary Celeste sailed, two captains talking the way captains do about weather and cargo and the crossing ahead, and now here was Morehouse's own first mate telling him that Briggs's ship was empty, seemingly abandoned in haste, with no bodies and no clear cause, somewhere out in open water with no land in any direction that anyone could readily explain. It would not have been an easy report to give, or an easy one to receive, and it would only be the first of many times that the story of the Mary Celeste asked a listener to accept a set of facts that refused, stubbornly, to add up into any single satisfying shape. What DeVoe carried back with him that day was not an answer. It was a deck awash with water and no one to blame for it, a wheel turning on its own, and a certainty growing steadily as he climbed back down into the boat that whatever had happened aboard that ship had happened to people who left in a hurry but not in terror, a distinction that would matter more than almost anything else once the Mary Celeste came within reach of a harbor, and of the men whose job it would be to decide what her empty decks were worth. The cabin that DeVoe climbed down into was not a wrecked place. That is the detail that would follow him for the rest of his life, repeated in testimony, repeated in every account he ever gave of that morning, that he had expected wreckage, some sign of struggle or panic, and instead found a room that looked as though its occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and not yet come back. You would have felt it too had you gone down that companionway behind him, ducking your head under the low beam, the light falling in a slant through the small skylight above. The air below would have been close and still, smelling faintly of damp wood and the last of a meal, and nothing in that stillness would have told you anything terrible had happened here. On the table in the captain's cabin sat a meal that no one had finished. An egg, some say, still standing in its cup, a child's plate. The specifics blur a little across the different tellings. The men who first went aboard did not think to inventory a breakfast, only to remark, years later, that it was there, that food had been laid out and barely touched, as though whatever had called the family and crew away had done so between one spoonful and the next. Sarah Briggs, Benjamin's wife, had a small parlor organ set up in the cabin, and near it, folded with the unhurried neatness of someone who meant to come back to it, was needlework, a hem half-turned, a needle still threaded. There is a particular kind of quiet in a piece of sewing left mid-stitch. It says more plainly than any log entry could that the person holding it did not believe she was leaving for good. 2-year-old Sophia's things were there as well, a small toy, a scattering of a child's belongings tucked into the space where a family had tried to make an ordinary home out of a cabin at sea. You do not need to picture this in any great detail to feel the weight of it. It is enough to know that a child had been living aboard that ship, playing in that narrow space, and that whatever happened, happened to her too. If your eyes are already closing, let that thought settle rather than sharpen. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, only the shape of a family's ordinary morning interrupted. Beyond the domestic clutter, the ship herself was, by every account, in remarkably good order. The cargo hold held its full complement of denatured alcohol, barrel after barrel lashed and stacked exactly as it should have been, with only a handful found later to have leaked or come loose. Nothing that suggested a great disaster in the hold itself. The ship's papers, aside from one notable absence, were largely where they should have been. Benjamin Briggs kept a tight ship, and it showed even in his absence. Charts still in their place, instruments mostly stowed, the logbook itself resting where a captain would leave it, its last entry dated some 9 days before the Mary Celeste was found, written in the unremarkable hand of a man recording an unremarkable position, with no hint in the ink itself of what was coming. But if the table was still laid and the hold still full, if the ship herself seemed so entirely undisturbed, what then was actually gone? Because something was. And it was in the shape of that absence, more than anything left behind, that the real strangeness of the Mary Celeste would come to live. The ship's single lifeboat, a yawl normally lashed across the main hatch, was missing entirely, along with the fittings that had held it there, cut away by the look of things, rather than torn loose by any storm. Some of the navigational instruments were gone too, the chronometer, the sextant, the ship's papers of registry that a captain would be required to produce at any port. A sounding line lay out on deck, uncoiled, as though it had been used and simply left. There was rope trailing from the peak halyard over the stern, its end down in the water, frayed in a way that suggested it had either broken under strain or been paid out deliberately and never hauled back in. None of it, taken alone, meant very much. Taken together, it began to sketch the outline of people who had left in a hurry, but with their wits about them, who had gathered instruments and papers, put the family into the yawl, and pushed off from a ship they still believed at that moment could sink beneath them. That is the shape Devoe himself came to favor, turning it over on the long tow back toward Gibraltar. Not mutiny, not attack, but a captain's judgment made in a moment of fear that turned out, as far as anyone could ever tell, to have been mistaken. A ship taking on water, or seeming to. A quick decision to put everyone into the boat and stand off at a safe distance, tied by that long line trailing from the stern, meaning to reboard once the danger passed or the weather settled. And then, somehow, the line parting, or the wind rising faster than anyone expected, and the Mary Celeste sailing on alone under her set canvas, while the yawl and everyone in it fell farther and farther behind, out into an ocean that kept no records of where they went. It is a theory, not a certainty, one of several that would be argued over in salvage courts and newspaper columns for decades afterward, and none of them, then or since, has ever closed the case entirely. What can be said, and said plainly, is this. The Mary Celeste was found provisioned for months, her hold full, her papers mostly in order, her family's most private and ordinary belongings sitting untouched in a cabin below deck, and yet not one living soul remained aboard her to explain any of it. A ship that looked in every particular except the one that mattered exactly as she should have. It is that contradiction, more than any single missing item, that would follow her into Gibraltar Harbour, where men in wigs and robes were about to spend weeks trying to decide what, precisely, they were looking at. There was more to find if you kept looking, and Devoe and the two men with him did keep looking, moving from the cabin back up into the weather and along the deck in the strange hush of a ship that answered the wheel but had no one to hold it. Below the captain's bed, tucked where a man might reach for it without rising, lay a sword, not drawn in defense, not left mid-swing, just resting in its place the way a razor rests in its case. Someone would later notice a scattering of reddish marks along its blade and along one rail on deck, and for a while those marks would do a great deal of work in the newspapers, hinting at knife fights and mutiny and blood spilled in the dark. It would be years before anyone tested them properly, and longer still before the answer settled into something duller than a headline. Rust, most likely, and the kind of stain a damp blade gathers on its own, with no violence required to explain it. The pumps told their own smaller story. One had been partly taken apart, its sounding pipe pulled loose, as though someone had been checking the level of water in the bilge and had not finished the job or had not liked what the job was telling them. The reading that could be reconstructed afterward put perhaps 3.5 feet of water down there, enough to worry a cautious man, nowhere near enough, by the judgment of the surveyors who examined her later, to threaten a ship of her build with any real prospect of going down. But a captain standing on his own deck, feeling his ship a little heavier underfoot than he expected, does not have the benefit of a later surveyor's calm arithmetic. He has only the sound of water somewhere below him that he cannot see, and a wife and daughter he cannot risk on a guess. Up on deck, the sails would not settle into any single story either. Some were set and drawing, doing exactly the work that had carried the Mary Celeste those last few miles under her own power, with no hand at the wheel. Others were furled, and one or two, when the wind and salt were finally done with them, showed tears along their seams that looked less like storm damage and more like sails that had simply been left too long to a weather they were never trimmed to meet. The rigging in places ran loose and unattended, lines that should have been coiled hanging in slack loops, as though whoever had last stood on that deck had been thinking about something other than good seamanship, which is perhaps the plainest way of saying what everyone already suspected, that the last hands on the Mary Celeste had been frightened. None of it, Devoe and his men agreed, looked like the work of pirates or of a crew turned murderous against their own captain. There was too much left behind for that. Too much order still holding in the hold and the stores, and nothing missing that a robber would have wanted and a frightened sailor would not have. What they had, as near as 3 men standing on a drifting deck in the middle of an ocean could ever hope to have, was a ship worth saving and a mystery worth carrying home. So they set about doing exactly that, dividing themselves thin across 2 vessels, trimming what canvas they dared, and turning the Mary Celeste's bow at last toward a harbour where questions like these were somebody else's trade. The 2 ships came into the Strait of Gibraltar within a day of each other, the Dei Gratia leading, the Mary Celeste trailing a little behind under her patched and reduced sail. Looking from a distance almost ordinary, you would have had to know what she was to feel anything looking at her. Just another brigantine finding her way home, nothing in her rigging to say that the men who trimmed it were strangers to her, that her own crew had vanished somewhere between one page of the log and the next. Morehouse had made his decision back on that empty deck, weighing the risk of losing men and time against the reward of a salvage claim, and now the arithmetic of that decision was about to be tested in front of people who owed him nothing and trusted him rather less. A ship brought into port under salvage was not simply handed over with thanks. It was argued over in rooms with high windows and long tables by men whose whole trade was doubt. You come into Gibraltar Harbour the way anyone did in those years, the rock rising up ahead of you long before the town does, pale and enormous, so that the whole approach feels like sailing toward a wall. The water inside the bay was crowded even on an ordinary day. Naval vessels, merchantmen waiting on wind or orders, small boats threading between them all, and into that crowd came the Dei Gratia, and behind her, the Mary Celeste, drawing eyes the way any story half told draws them. Word travels fast in a harbour. By the time both ships had made fast, there would have been men on the quay already asking each other what it meant. A ship arriving with a second crew aboard her and no explanation offered beyond what the newcomers themselves could say. It was here that Frederick Solly Flood entered the story, and it is worth sitting with him for a moment because so much of what followed sat on his shoulders. Flood was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, and also, by the arrangement of the colony, its Advocate General and Proctor for the Queen in the Court of Admiralty, a man who wore several hats and wore them by most accounts with more enthusiasm than patience. He had not been aboard the Mary Celeste. He had not seen the cabin, the table, the sewing machine left mid-stitch. What he had was a story that did not add up cleanly, and a temperament that did not care for stories that failed to add up. From the very first hearing, Flood made his suspicion plain. He did not believe that what Morehouse and his men described was the whole truth, and he said so in language that left little room for a modest sailor to defend himself. You would have felt the weight of that suspicion the moment you stepped into the courtroom, even before a word of testimony was given. It was not a large room, and it would not have needed to be. The case did not call for spectators so much as for careful men bent over paper, going through a story sentence by sentence to see where it gave. Flood's theory, offered early and pursued hard, was that the crew of the Dei Gratia themselves had done away with the Mary Celeste's people, perhaps for the alcohol in her hold, perhaps to manufacture the very salvage claim they were now standing in this room to collect. It was not a subtle accusation. It placed Oliver Devoe, the same chief mate who had climbed aboard the drifting ship with 2 other men, who had pumped her hold dry with his own arms and felt the deck settle steady beneath him, in the position of having to answer, under oath, for a crime he insisted he had not seen any sign of, let alone committed. Devoe had already told his story once, out on the water, to the men who stood with him on that empty deck. Now he told it again, more formally, to men who wrote down every word and weighed it against the timbers of the ship herself. He held to it without much variation, the wheel unlashed and swinging free, no boat, the compass smashed, the hatch off the forward hold, the sea sloshing an arm's depth in the well, but nothing more, no wounds on the wood, no blood he could find, nothing that spoke of a struggle. It was, in its way, the strangest kind of testimony to give, because there was so little violence in it to describe. A man accused of mutiny or murder usually has some physical trace to explain away. Devoe had almost nothing. An orderly ship, a missing crew, and his own insistence that he had found her exactly as he said. If you had been sitting in that courtroom through the long weeks of argument, you might have started to feel the strain of it yourself. The sense of a case straining against evidence that simply would not cooperate with either the theory the court wanted or the innocence the crew claimed. Flood pressed hard on the physical evidence because physical evidence was the only kind this case could ever have. Surveyors were sent to examine the Mary Celeste herself, looking for marks that might tell the story her crew could not, cuts along the rail that some read as sword strokes and others read as ordinary wear from cargo handling, stains on a blade found aboard that were tested and found, in the end, to be rust rather than blood. Each new finding seemed, for a day or two, to promise the breakthrough the court wanted, and each one dissolved on closer study into something explainable, something a working ship might carry after any ordinary voyage. It must have been exhausting for the men doing that work, going over rope and rail and deck plank by plank, hoping the wood itself would finally tell them what 9 people could not. If you have ever searched a house for something you were certain must be there, running your hand along the same shelf a third time as though it might have changed since the last, you already know something of what those weeks felt like inside that courtroom. Flood widened his suspicion as the physical evidence kept failing him, questioning not only the Dei Grazia's crew, but eventually casting doubt on Benjamin Briggs himself, and even on the honesty of the barrels of alcohol sitting in the hold, as though the whole voyage might have been staged from the very start for some purpose no one could quite name. It is a strange thing watching an inquiry search so hard for a plot that it begins inventing candidates rather than admitting it has found none. But that was the shape this hearing took, session after session, through the last months of the year and into the next, while the Mary Celeste sat at anchor in the harbour, patient as ships always are, waiting for men to decide what to make of her. But what does a hearing even do in the end when the only witness left to question is a ship that offers nothing back? It does what this one did. It wears itself down. The surveys kept turning up more ambiguity than answers, and no evidence ever surfaced that could tie the Dei Grazia's men to any crime, however hard Flood searched for it. Slowly, over weeks that must have felt endless to Morehouse and his crew, standing accused of something the record could not support, the case shifted from suspicion of murder toward a much narrower and more practical question. How much of a salvage award, if any, the men who brought the ship in were owed? It is worth letting that sit for a moment before it slips past you, the way it slipped past the court itself. A hearing that opened with an accusation of mass murder closing months later on a dispute over money. The court did eventually rule. Salvage was awarded to Morehouse and his crew, but at a rate far below what such a rescue would ordinarily have commanded, 1/5 of the ship and cargo's assessed value, where a clean and uncomplicated salvage might have brought a much larger share. No formal reasoning was ever given for exactly why the figure landed where it did, though it is not hard to guess that lingering suspicion, even unproven, had shaped the number Flood and his court were willing to sign off on. No charges were brought against Morehouse, Devoe, or any man of the Dei Grazia. No one was ever arrested in Gibraltar or anywhere after for what had happened aboard the Mary Celeste. And the fate of Briggs, his wife, his young daughter, and the crew who had sailed with him out of New York was left exactly where it had been the day the ship was found, open, undecided, unresolved by any court, any surveyor, or any theory that Flood or anyone else in that room had managed to make stick. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right place for them to be, because what remains of this story from here is less about verdicts than about guesses, the long parade of theories that grew up in the empty space the court left behind, reaching for pirates, for waterspouts, for mutiny, for something stranger still, each one trying to fill a silence that Gibraltar itself had failed to fill. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right place for them to be, because what remains of this story from here is less about verdicts than about guesses, the long parade of theories that grew up in the empty space the court left behind, reaching for pirates, for waterspouts, for mutiny, for something stranger still, each one trying to fill a silence that Gibraltar itself had failed to fill. You have to picture the kind of silence this was, not an absence of talk. There was plenty of that, in every port from New York to London to the taverns along the Gibraltar waterfront, but an absence of anything solid to hang the talk on. A ship with her sails set and nobody at the wheel invites exactly the kind of story a sailor loves to tell on a slow watch, and by the time the Mary Celeste had been idle in Gibraltar Harbour for even a few weeks, half a dozen competing explanations were already circulating among the men who worked that stretch of water. Each one built less from evidence than from what a particular kind of man found easiest to believe about the sea. The first, and in some ways the most obvious to sailors who had seen crews turn ugly before, was mutiny. Somewhere out past the Azores, so the theory ran, the men forward of the mast had risen against Benjamin Briggs, a captain some imagined as harsh, though nothing in the record supports that, murdered him and his family, and fled in the yawl with whatever they could carry. It is a tidy story, and tidy stories travel well. But you would only have to stand where Oliver Deveau stood, in that narrow cabin with its untouched writing desk and its bottle of children's cough medicine, still upright, to feel how badly the tidy story fit the room. A crew violent enough to murder a captain's wife and small daughter, then organized enough to leave behind money, valuables, and a fully stocked ship without so much as overturning a chair, is not a crew that behaves like any mutiny on record. Deveau himself, when he gave his evidence at the hearing, described a vessel with no sign of struggle anywhere in it, no blood, no broken furniture, no torn clothing. And it was that testimony, offered calmly and without embellishment, that did more than anything else to quiet the mutiny theory in the rooms where it mattered. Piracy came next, and made even less sense the longer anyone looked at it. Pirates in that part of the Atlantic in the 1870s were rare enough on their own, and pirates who murder or abduct an entire crew and then leave behind 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol, a captain's gold watch, and money in a cabin drawer are pirates who have somehow forgotten what piracy is for. You do not board a ship to take nothing. Whoever left the Mary Celeste empty took the yawl, the ship's papers, the chronometer and the sextant, instruments a captain would reach for if he believed he might need to navigate a small boat back to safety, and left everything else exactly where it had been stowed. It was the kind of detail that quietly ended a dozen dockside theories at once, because piracy explains a great deal. But it has never once in the history of the sea explained an untouched cargo hold. There was insurance fraud too, whispered rather than argued, and Gibraltar's own Advocate General, Frederick Solly Flood, gave it more weight than most historians since have thought it deserved. In this version, Briggs or the ship's owners had arranged some scheme to profit from a disappearance, perhaps in league with the crew of the Dei Gratia. But a man does not fake his own death by taking his wife and his 2-year-old daughter along with him, and the finances of both ships, once examined, showed nothing that pointed toward fraud, no debts pressing hard enough to explain it, no policy strangely inflated in the weeks before departure. Flood pressed the idea anyway for a while, because a courtroom under public pressure often prefers a villain to an unanswered question, but the theory had nowhere to root itself once the numbers were actually checked. And then, further out at the edges of the harbour gossip, where sailors told stories mostly to frighten the newer men, there were the stranger explanations. A sea monster rising beneath the hull, a giant squid dragging men over the rail one by one, a waterspout twisting up out of a calm sea and snatching the crew into the sky. You would have heard these told if you had sat in the right tavern that winter, with the kind of conviction sailors reserve for things they have never seen but desperately want to believe are possible, because a monster is at least an answer, and an answer is easier to sleep on than a mystery with no shape at all. But did any of these explanations survive contact with what the boarding party had actually found aboard her? Almost none of them, not for long, once the physical evidence was set beside the stories, rather than left to drift alongside them. A monster or a waterspout might carry off men from an open deck, but it does not explain a ship still under sail, still on her course, still dry enough below that the survey found only a little water in the hold, nowhere near the flooding that would have driven an experienced captain like Briggs to abandon a sound vessel in a panic. It does not explain the sewing machine left mid-stitch in the cabin, a small, unfinished detail that told investigators the departure had not been sudden violence, but something closer to an orderly, if hurried, decision. Nor does it explain the yawl missing from its davits, taken deliberately, which argued for people leaving under their own power rather than being seized against it. This is the part of the story where it helps to let your shoulders settle back into the mattress, because none of what follows resolves neatly. And there is nothing wrong with drifting through an unsolved question rather than out the far side of it. What the surveyors in Gibraltar kept returning to, in their reports and in their testimony, was the strange particular combination the ship presented. No violence, no storm damage severe enough to explain abandonment, a cargo virtually untouched, valuables left in plain sight, and yet a small boat gone and every soul missing. Each theory that tried to explain one part of that puzzle failed to explain another, which is why, more than a century and a half later, historians still argue over which imperfect explanation comes closest, rather than agreeing on which one is simply true. What grew instead, in the space where an answer should have been, was fascination. And fascination, once loose in the newspapers of the 1870s, rarely stayed within the boundaries of what the Gibraltar court had actually recorded. Papers in Britain and America printed accounts that added blood where the survey had found none, described cutlass marks on the rail that no surveyor ever mentioned, and in at least one widely reprinted account, invented a half-eaten breakfast still steaming on the cabin table, a detail so vivid and so often repeated that many readers came to believe it was part of the official record. It was not. The actual survey mentioned an untouched meal, not a warm one, but the warmth made a better story, and better stories, then as now, traveled faster than corrections ever could. A young writer named Arthur Conan Doyle would go further still a few years later, publishing a piece of fiction loosely built on the case that renamed the ship, invented a survivor, and gave the story a lurid ending it had never actually had. And though he wrote it plainly as fiction, many readers took it for fact, and the embellishments folded themselves permanently into the legend. From that point on, the Mary Celeste in the public imagination and the Mary Celeste in the Gibraltar record began to drift apart, the way two ships might separate slowly on the same calm sea until the distance between them was too wide to easily close. It is worth pausing here, before the theories carry you any further from the people at the center of them, to remember who this speculation was actually about. Somewhere in all of it, the mutiny stories, the pirate stories, the monsters and the waterspouts, were Sarah Elizabeth Briggs and her small daughter Sophia, a woman who had written home cheerfully about the ship's steady progress, and a 2-year-old who had likely spent her last certain days watching the sea from her mother's arms rather than anything resembling the drama later ages would invent for her. No theory ever offered for what happened to the Mary Celeste has ever quite managed to account for what happened to the two of them without simply guessing. And it is easy in the middle of a good mystery to forget that the mystery was built on the disappearance of an actual family, not a puzzle designed for entertainment. That, more than any theory of mutiny or fraud or sea monster, is what kept the case alive in serious circles long after the newspapers moved on to other wonders. The sense that something ordinary and human had gone wrong out on the water, and that the ordinary explanation, whatever it was, had simply never surfaced. And it is that gap between what the age of sail was willing to imagine and what modern investigators would eventually be able to test, that the story turns toward next. For 100 years, the case belonged mostly to imagination, to newspapermen and novelists and insurance clerks with theories they could never test. It was only much later, well into the last century, that anyone brought instruments and chemistry back to a story that had, until then, only ever needed a good telling. And what they found, when they finally looked closely at the cargo itself, was not a monster and not a mutiny. It was something far more ordinary, and in its own way far more unsettling, because it meant the ship had very nearly done nothing wrong at all. Picture the hold as it would have been that autumn, packed tight with barrels of industrial alcohol bound for the wine merchants of Genoa, more than 1,600 of them stacked in the dark below the waterline. You would have smelled it before you saw it had you gone down that ladder, sharp and chemical, nothing like the wine it was meant to fortify. 9 of those barrels, made of a more porous red oak rather than the white oak of the rest, were found empty when Oliver Devoe's men finally broke open the hatches at Gibraltar. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Barrels leaked. It was the sort of detail that got a line in a report and nothing more. But when a chemist named Andrea Sella recreated the conditions inside that hold, decades later, for an audience watching what he called a controlled demonstration, something else emerged. Alcohol vapor, leaking slowly from porous wood into a warm, poorly ventilated space, does not need a spark to become dangerous. It can ignite in what looks almost like a soft flash, no scorching, no splinters, nothing a boarding party would ever find weeks afterward, because there was nothing left to find. A rolling ball of pale fire gone in an instant, leaving the hold no worse for it structurally, but leaving anyone standing near the hatch with the absolute conviction that the ship was about to come apart beneath them. You do not have to understand the chemistry to feel what that moment would have done to a captain who had never carried alcohol before and had no way of knowing whether it would happen again, worse, in 10 minutes or in an hour. That is the shape the theory takes now in most serious retellings, not an explosion in the way a landsman would picture one, with timber thrown into the air and fire raging through the rigging, but something quieter and stranger, a pressure wave, a burst of heat and noise from below that would have reached you as a physical shock, even from the deck, the kind of sound that goes through the soles of your feet before your ears have made sense of it. Briggs had loaded that cargo himself in New York, had walked the wharf and signed for every barrel, a careful man doing a careful man's due diligence on freight he had never carried before. It would have been exactly the kind of uncertainty that gnawed at someone like him, not reckless fear, but the specific, informed anxiety of a man who understood ships well enough to know what he did not know about this one thing sitting in his hold. There is a second thread that runs alongside the fumes, and it concerns the pumps. When Devoe's men went below, they found the sounding rod lying loose on deck rather than stowed where it belonged, and the pumps themselves partly dismantled, as though someone had been working on them in a hurry and never finished. The bilge held perhaps 3.5 feet of water, enough to worry a crew who suspected the worst, not nearly enough to sink a ship of that size on its own. But a blocked or malfunctioning pump can lie to a captain in the cruelest way possible, making a manageable amount of water look like the beginning of the end, especially in the dark, especially with a storm not long behind you and nerves already worn thin by whatever had happened with the alcohol. If your only instrument for judging your own survival is telling you something false, you act on the false thing. That is not panic. That is a sailor doing exactly what he was trained to do with bad information. So the two theories sit together rather than in competition, the fumes giving Briggs a reason to fear the ship itself, the pumps giving him a reason to believe that fear was already coming true. Neither one requires villainy. Neither one requires anybody aboard Mary Celeste to have done anything but respond sensibly to what the ship seemed to be telling them. And there is something almost peaceful in that thought, if you let it settle, that the mystery was never really about wickedness at all, only about a string of small, believable misjudgments made by people who had every reason to think they were choosing the safer path. But if the ship never actually failed beneath them, if the hull held, if the water never rose past what the pumps could manage, if the fire, such as it was, had already burned itself out in seconds, then why would trained sailors climb down into an open boat and leave her at all? This is where the modern investigation arrives at what most historians now consider the most probable answer, though they are careful, all of them, to use that word and not a stronger one. The theory holds that Briggs, faced with what he believed might be a hold full of dangerous, possibly reigniting fumes, and uncertain just how much water the ship was truly taking on, made the decision that any captain responsible for his own family and crew might make. He did not abandon ship in despair. He evacuated it temporarily as a precaution, ordering everyone into the yawl, the small boat lashed to the main hatch, and having it towed a safe distance behind the ship on a line so that they could watch her from the water and reboard once they were satisfied she was not about to go down or catch fire in earnest. You can imagine it clearly enough if you try. The whole family and crew crowded into that small boat in the dark, Sarah holding the child close against the cold coming off the water, the men at the oars keeping just enough tension on the line to stay near without drifting under the counter. It would have felt for a while like the sensible thing. The frayed end of a halyard was found still attached to the ship when Devoe came aboard, exactly the kind of line that might have been used for towing a boat, and exactly the kind of line that might part under strain if a swell caught the yawl wrong or a sudden gust pulled harder than expected. If your rope lets go in open water, in the dark, with 9 people and no sail set on the ship you have just left, there may be nothing you can do at all. No way to row back against a wind that is carrying your only shelter away from you faster than you can follow it. From there, the sea does the rest, and the sea does not keep records. A squall, a night of hard rowing in the wrong direction, exhaustion, distance, any of it would have been enough, and none of it would have left so much as a splinter behind. It is, in its way, the gentlest explanation the case has ever produced, because it asks for no monster and no murderer, only a small boat, a length of failed rope, and an ocean that has swallowed better sailors than these under far less strange circumstances. If your eyes have already started to close somewhere in this telling, that feels almost right. The story wants, in the end, to rest. It would be comfortable to leave it there, tidy and settled, and more than one documentary has done exactly that. But honesty requires a little less certainty than a tidy ending allows. The fume theory has never been proven to have happened aboard Mary Celeste specifically, only shown to be chemically possible under the conditions that existed in her hold. The pump theory rests on physical evidence that could support several different readings, and the evacuation and lost boat hypothesis, however widely favored among historians who have spent careers on this one case, remains a reconstruction built from rope ends and sounding rods and the shape of human fear, not a confession pulled from a survivor. No wreckage of that yawl was ever found. No body from the Mary Celeste was ever recovered, then or since. The scholarly debate that has run for more than a century has not closed. It has only grown more disciplined, trading sea serpents for probability, and settling at best on the theory that seems least to require anything extraordinary at all. What remains certain is only the shape of the evidence itself, the untouched cabin, the abandoned meal, the ship sailing on alone. And it is to what became of that evidence, and of the ship herself, once the hearing at Gibraltar was finally done with her, that the story turns next. The hearing at Gibraltar released her in the end, as hearings of that kind usually do, with no verdict that satisfied anyone and no crime that could be proven against the men who had brought her in. The day Gratia's owners collected a salvage award, smaller than they had hoped for, tainted by Solly Flood's suspicions, and Captain Morehouse sailed on to whatever quieter voyages history did not bother to record. The Mary Celeste herself, provisioned again, rigged again, sold again, went back to the only trade a ship of her kind had ever known. You would think, given everything that had happened to her, that no one would want her. You would be wrong. There was money to be made carrying cargo across an ocean, and a used ship, however strange her history, was still cheaper than a new one. So she changed hands, and then changed hands again, And if you had stood on any wharf from Boston to Genoa in the years that followed and watched her come in under a new owner's colors, you might not even have known you were looking at the ship the newspapers had spent months arguing over. What you would have noticed if you had known where to look was how little luck seemed to follow her. A ship is supposed to earn her keep quietly, cargo in, cargo out, and the Mary Celeste seemed constitutionally unable to manage it. She ran aground. She caught fire, twice, in her hold, the kind of small, stubborn fire that smolders in cargo and has to be dug out rather than doused. She lost captains to illness and to disputes with their crews, and at least one owner found himself pursued through the courts by men who felt they had been cheated on her account. None of it was supernatural. Ships of that age ran aground and burned and changed captains all the time, and a fair reading of the record shows a vessel that was simply getting old, her timbers tired, her rigging patched rather than replaced, passing from owner to owner precisely because no one who understood ships wanted to keep her long. But sailors are not always fair readers of a record, and by then the story of the empty cabin and the untouched meal had traveled further than any bill of sale. Say her name on a dock in the 1870s and you were as likely to get a laugh as a shrug, and either one carried the same suspicion underneath it that this was a ship marked by something, whether or not anyone believed in marks. You do not need to carry any of this with you as it drifts past. It is only the slow unraveling of an old vessel's reputation, the kind of quiet decline that happened to 100 ships whose names nobody remembers at all. Let it settle, and let the story move on toward the men who finally decided to use that reputation, rather than fear it, for their own purposes. Because that is really what happened to her in the end. The men who took her over in her last years were not superstitious about the Mary Celeste. They were something colder than that. They were practical about her, in a way that made the earlier owner's bad luck look almost innocent by comparison. A ship with a reputation for misfortune, it turns out, is a ship whose loss surprises no one. And if you were the kind of man looking for a vessel that could be made to disappear without too many questions being asked, you could hardly have designed a better one than the Mary Celeste had already become. So how does a ship carrying a name like that finally come to her end? By the time you reach 1884, the Mary Celeste has passed through more hands than most vessels manage in twice her years, and the man who finally buys a controlling share in her is a Boston shipping man named Gilman C. Parker, working with a small syndicate of partners. What they buy is not, by any honest account, a sound ship. She is old, her seams work, her worth on paper bears very little relation to what she could actually fetch from a buyer who intended to use her. What Parker's syndicate does next is load her, at Boston, with a cargo of goods insured for a sum that had almost no connection to their real value. Boots and shoes, alongside a mixture of cheaper goods, the whole consignment covered by policies that would pay out handsomely if the cargo were lost at sea. You do not have to know much about the shipping trade of that era to guess what came next, only to notice how carefully the pieces had been arranged before the ship ever left the harbor. She sailed for Port-au-Prince, in Haiti, under Parker's command, and in January of 1885 she came to grief on a well-known reef called Rochelois Bank, a hazard so plainly marked on the charts of the day that an experienced captain running his ship onto it looked, to nearly everyone who examined the wreck afterward, less like an accident and more like an appointment. Investigators who went out to the site found the cargo strangely arranged for a vessel that had supposedly struck in an emergency, and found, too, that much of what had been insured so richly was in fact worth very little at all, bricks in some of the crates where boots should have been by one account, or at least goods far short of what the policies claimed. Parker and his partners were brought up on charges of barratry, the old maritime crime of defrauding a ship's owners or underwriters, and for a while it looked as though the Mary Celeste might finally deliver the kind of courtroom drama her earlier voyage never had. But the case fell apart in the way these cases often did in that era, evidence disputed, witnesses uncertain, and no one was ever convicted of deliberately wrecking her. What is recorded and repeated by nearly every historian who has since looked into it is that Parker's reputation and his fortunes did not survive the affair regardless. He died within the year, by most accounts a ruined man shunned by the trade that had once trusted him with cargo and command, and none of his partners fared much better in the small, watchful world of Boston shipping. And there, more or less, the Mary Celeste ends, not in a mystery at all, but in something far more ordinary and far less dignified. A tired ship, deliberately run onto a reef that any competent captain would have known to avoid, sacrificed for an insurance payment by men who had bought her cheap precisely because her name already carried the smell of bad luck. It is almost funny, in the quiet way John finds most things about this story funny, that the vessel, famous the world over for vanishing her crew without a trace, should meet her actual end through nothing stranger than greed and a badly kept set of books. The newspapers that had once filled columns with sea serpents and derelict horrors barely noticed when she went down for good. There was no mystery left in it for them to sell. It is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, the distance between the two endings this one ship was given. The first ending, the one that never actually happened, the crew lost to some unknowable violence or terror in mid-Atlantic, became a story told and retold for a century, embroidered by every writer who touched it, remembered by people who could not have named another merchant ship from the whole of the 1870s. The second ending, the true one, involved no vanished crew and no unexplained silence, only a captain who understood exactly what he was doing when he steered her onto the rocks, and a set of underwriters who eventually had to pay out on a fraud they could never quite prove in court. One ending made her immortal. The other, the real one, barely made the papers. There is something almost tender in that unfairness, if you let yourself feel it that way, that a ship could be so much more interesting to the world for a crime that was never committed than for the ordinary, grubby one that actually killed her. She rests now on Rocheleau Bank, wherever exactly her timbers finally gave up the last of themselves to salt water, and no memorial marks the spot, because by 1885, nobody thought there was anything left of her worth mourning. What outlived the wreck, though, was never the ship herself. It was the story. The one about the empty cabin and the untouched meal and the crew who were simply gone. And that story had already begun, long before Gilman Parker ever bought his ruined vessel, to grow into something the plain facts could never quite contain. It is to that growth, the slow transformation of an ordinary maritime mystery into one of the most retold legends of the sea, that the rest of this telling now turns. It is worth pausing here in the dark on a small and rather ordinary fact. Nobody who found that ship drifting had used the word ghost. The men who boarded her spoke only of an empty deck and a hull that answered the sea well enough on its own. The word came later. It always does. And the man who did more than anyone to attach it, permanently, it turns out, was not a sailor, an investigator, or even yet a household name. He was a young doctor in Portsmouth, not yet 30, with failing eyesight in one eye from a bout of illness, and rather more time on his hands than patience. You would not have picked him out of a crowd. He had published almost nothing. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and in 1884, more than a decade after the ship was found, he sat down and wrote a story that would outlive every fact this telling has given you so far. He called it J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, and he did not put his own name to it. It appeared unsigned in Cornhill magazine, presented with just enough seriousness that some readers took it, at least for a moment, as a genuine account rather than fiction. Doyle changed the ship's name very slightly, so slightly you could read past it without noticing. Not the Mary Celeste you have been sitting with for 13 sections now, but the Marie Celeste, a single letter added, a small vowel that would go on to confuse readers, librarians, and eventually search engines for well over a century. If you have ever heard someone call her that, Marie, not Mary, you have heard Doyle's fingerprint, still pressed into the story more than 100 years after he left it there, and he did not stop at the name. In his account, the breakfast on the table was untouched, cups still full, as though the crew had been lifted away between one spoonful and the next. In his account, there were swords found below deck with what looked like blood dried along the blade. There was a suggestion of vengeance, of a formerly enslaved man aboard with an old grievance, of a fate half supernatural. None of it, not one detail, appears anywhere in the Gibraltar hearing you have already walked through with me. The one presided over by an advocate general who suspected fraud and mutiny and very nearly everything except ghosts, and who at least confined his suspicions to men rather than spirits. The actual inquiry found a table with a meal that had likely been cleared rather than abandoned mid-bite. It found no swords stained with anything but the ordinary tarnish of iron left in a damp cabin. It found a sewing machine with a spool of thread still socketed in place, a chest of drawers slightly disturbed by water, and cargo sitting largely where it had been stowed in New York. The truth, in other words, was a ship that looked as though everyone aboard her had simply meant to come back in a few minutes. Doyle's version gave you a ship that looked as though something had reached up through the deck and taken them. One of those images keeps you awake. Only one of them happened. It is worth sitting with that difference for a moment before we let it go, because it says something about which kind of story survives, not the one that is true, necessarily, but the one that gives you somewhere to put your fear. You do not need to hold on to the details of either version tonight. Let both drift, if you like, the real table and the invented one, and let the rest of this settle over you the way it settled over a century of readers who never quite untangled the two. But why did a name change stick so easily? And why did nobody notice for decades that the ship in the story and the ship in the historical record weren't quite the same vessel at all? Partly, it is because Doyle was, by the time anyone thought to check, the most famous writer in the English language, and fame has a way of retroactively authorizing whatever a famous person once touched. By the time readers were encountering Sherlock Holmes, some of them went backward through Doyle's bibliography and found this earlier, stranger tale and took its details on faith the way you might take a detective's deductions on faith, because the voice telling you sounded so certain. Newspapers reprinted pieces of it as though they were historical color rather than invention. Other writers, hunting for a good yarn, borrowed Doyle's swords and his untouched breakfast rather than doing the slower work of reading a salvage hearing transcript, and each retelling sanded the truth down a little further and buffed the invention up a little brighter. You can watch this happen with almost any story that survives long enough. A detail repeated 3 times sounds more true than a detail stated once and left alone, whether or not anyone ever checks the source. And so the ship sailed on, so to speak, through the 20th century, appearing in film treatments and radio dramas and paperback anthologies of the unexplained, nearly always under Doyle's spelling, nearly always with his invented horrors intact. She became a kind of shorthand. You did not need to explain what you meant if you said something had gone as strange as the Celeste. Everyone in the room already had the picture, the steaming cup of tea, the abandoned meal, the sense of a crew snatched clean out of their own lives. It made for a wonderful campfire line. It made for a terrible history. What got lost in all that borrowing, section after section, decade after decade, was not a detail. It was a set of people. Somewhere underneath every retelling of the ghost ship sat a captain who had brought his wife and small daughter to sea because he could not bear a season apart from them, and a mate who had sailed with him before and trusted him enough to sign on again, and 4 men from the German islands who had likely never met an American captain before that winter and never would again. Their names simply were not useful to the legend. A ghost story does not need to know that the captain's daughter had a small melodeon aboard for her lessons, or that the mate had served competently enough to be trusted with the wheel on the worst nights. It only needs an empty ship and a closed door. If there is a way to answer 100 years of borrowed swords and invented blood, it is only this: to say the names again, plainly, the way the record actually gives them to us, and let them sit here a moment longer than the myth ever allowed them to. Benjamin Briggs, a careful man who checked his own rigging with his own hands rather than trusting the word of a foreman. Sarah, his wife, who came aboard not out of recklessness, but because a decade of separate winters had worn thin, and who by all accounts kept the cabin as orderly as any parlor ashore. Sophia, not yet school-aged, whose sewing machine and picture books were found still in their places, waiting for a lesson that never resumed. And around them the crew, Albert Richardson, the first mate, and the others who came aboard from the German islands, men whose lives left almost nothing behind them but a line on a crew manifest, and a shared, unexplained absence from a ship that otherwise looked ready to sail on forever. That is where this one actually ends. Not with a sword, not with a steaming untouched cup, but with a short list of ordinary people who went out on the water together and did not come back, and a hull that carried on sailing, oddly enough, for over a decade afterward without them, as though it hadn't quite noticed they were gone. I think that is as good a place as any to leave it tonight. If you drifted off somewhere back around the swords and the sewing machine, that is exactly where you were meant to be. None of this was ever a test. There is nothing here you need to carry into tomorrow. Thank you for spending this stretch of the night with me and with the Briggs family and the crew who sailed with them. If this is the kind of story that settles you, there are others like it waiting here whenever you need one. For now, though, let the ship go. Let the water close back over all of it and let yourself rest. The hull itself went on a long while after that, sold and resold under new owners who rarely knew or asked what she had carried through the water that winter. She ran ordinary cargoes for years, quietly, the way any tired ship does, until a captain with debts he could not pay ran her deliberately onto a reef off Haiti and tried to collect on her insurance, a small sour footnote to a larger mystery. Even that failed. The sea kept her a little longer, then let her go for good, timbers scattering into sand that has never fully given them back.